It's astounding. Time is fleeting. Madness takes its toll. But listen closely.
Not for very much longer.
I've got to keep control.
I remember doing the time war, drinking those moments when the blackness would hit me and the void would be calling. Let's do the time war again. Let's do the time war again.
Welcome back to Time Warp the Sequel. Our previous travels took us from the beginning of musical theater through the Golden Age into the late 1950s. We pick up our journey in the 1960s, which is on fire with huge changes in the world. The 1960s saw major civil rights protests and then the assassination of the important leader of that movement, Martin Luther King Jr. America elected the first Catholic president in John F. Kennedy and also witnessed his assassination. We went to war in Vietnam under the implementation of the draft, which also caused major upheaval and protests. But we also saw Sidney Poitier win an Academy Award for Best Actor, making him the first Black actor to win that honor. The first miniskirt was designed in London, and the trend took off like wildfire. Rolling Stone magazine published its first issue. The birth control pill was introduced, and of course the British invasion, and a little party known as Woodstock. How did all of this affect musical theater? Well, this is a decade where we can still see some composers and theatergoers hanging on to the past for dear life, while others find themselves done with the cotton candy storylines of American Boy Makes Good and hard work can triumph over all. The world is watching their sons and brothers die in a war they can't understand. Political leaders are killed, and everything seems crazy and intense, so why wouldn't the theater confront the difficult? Topics were more sexual in nature and not in a subtle way. Capitalism and the man were being called out. A call for social change was an underlying theme in a number of shows that were produced in the 60s, and the music featured in those shows began to change. Of course, you still had your sweet, family-friendly stories with a message like Mary Poppins, Hello Dolly, and The Sound of Music, with the Golden Age-style vocals that accompanied the storyline. But those songs weren't getting radio airtime. The British invasion and the popularity of rock music meant that for the theater to stay relevant, it needed to incorporate that style of music. With the death of the great Oscar Hammerstein II in 1960, and the clamor for a new sound, new composers came onto the musical theater scene, and writers who were known for their older style started finding ways to remain relevant. Frank Lesser brought us How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, a show that represented the shift from the light-hearted subject matter of the previous decades to more sophisticated topics by satirizing American business and culture. Jerry Bach with director Jerome Robbins brought Fiddler on the Roof to the stage. Golden Age vocal styles telling the heart-wrenching story reflecting major cultural changes and upheavals that were happening all over the world. However, Cabaret, composed by John Kander, might be the quintessential musical of the 60s, representing the culmination of Broadway's move towards confronting more mature subject matters, with the setting of the show in a hedonistic nightclub called the Kit Kat Club during the time of the rise of the Nazis to power. Topics included homosexuality, abortion, and prostitution. Originally, the producer, David Black, envisioned Julie Andrews as the character of Sally Bowles, but her manager refused to allow her to accept the role due to the character's immorality. Some people just weren't ready for that much real in their art. Before we head into the 70s, there's one very important person that we need to highlight, and he will be a mainstay throughout the rest of our journey. That person is composer Stephen Sondheim, and it's right that we focus on him individually, because he really is in a category of his own. His compositions will challenge and inspire musicians for years to come. His writing style is very character-focused, and the vocal lines and vocal expectations of the singers are equally matched to the character and the challenges they present. In my opinion, nothing of his sounds the same, but there's a quality to his work that is recognizable. As a singer, you can be sure that you will be challenged as a musician and a vocalist. His reach stretches back to 1954 with Saturday Night, and also includes Gypsy in 1959. In 1962, he gave us A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, winning 6 Tony Awards. And in '64, he opened Anyone Can Whistle, which bombed after 9 performances. He followed that with The Girls Upstairs, which eventually became Follies, A Little Night Music, and Evening Primrose. We will revisit him soon, but now let's usher in the 1970s. And the way that happened in the world of musical theater was with Hair by composer Galt MacDermot. It opened on Broadway in April of '68 and is considered the most important show of the decade, not only by being the first rock musical, paving the way for the hits of the '70s, but also by redefining what was considered to be acceptable and commercially viable on Broadway. Cabaret was tame in comparison to this show, which confronted social problems relating to racial inequality, drugs, homosexuality, poverty, and the sexual revolution, and it included a now infamous nude scene. Fun fact, in 1968, the censorship of the content of plays in England under the Robert Walpole's Theatrical Licensing Act of 1737 was repealed on July 26, 1968, by the Theatre Act of 1968 that abolished censorship of the stage. Hair's opening was delayed until September 27, 1968, while it waited on the appeal so the theater could include nudity and profanity. So you might be thinking, okay, we're now naked on stage? That has to be the culmination of what Broadway can manage in the way of change. But you would be wrong. The 1970s are known in history as a pivot of change. It saw economic upheaval, and socially progressive values continued to grow with increasing political awareness and the fight for political liberty of women. There was a terrible economic recession due to an oil crisis, and the US saw an end to the Vietnam War. Music styles morphed and grew, incorporating disco, funk, jazz fusion, rock, and then punk rock. Classical music began really losing momentum, and Broadway ticket sales were plummeting. In 1968, sales were at roughly 9.5 million, dropping to 7.4 million in 1970, and then to 5.4 million in 1972. In 1968, nearly 10 million people took in a Broadway show, but by 1972, that number had fallen to 5 million, the lowest in history. During the post-World War II boom on Broadway, the Schubert Empire was valued at more than $400 million. But by 1972, its value had fallen to between 60 and 100 million. Louis Armstrong topped the charts in 1964 with the title song to Hello Dolly. But after that, with a few exceptions, show tunes rarely made Billboard's list after that. Something had to change. In 1971, Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice's Jesus Christ Superstar opened, marking the true beginning of the British invasion onto Broadway. The opening of Funny Girl in '64 introduced the body microphone to the stage, but by the '70s, its use was commonplace and frankly required so singers could manage the vocal load that came with the new sound of the theater. Another change was Broadway's acceptance of works with all-black casts, with the addition of Pearlie, which debuted in 1970, Raisin in 1973 by composer Judd Wolden, which was nominated for 9 Tony Awards and won 2 of them, and The Wiz by Charlie Smalls and others, which debuted in 1975 and then had its own big-budget film adaptation in 1978.
5, 6, 7, 8!
But the show that was credited with saving Broadway was Marvin Hamlish's A Chorus Line in 1975. The show was derived from hours of taped therapy sessions from traveling performers. Those stories were told by individual characters who were all at a Broadway audition vying for a spot in the show. It was raw and real, and the best thing about it was it could be produced real cheap. The set was minimalistic, but the power of the stories and the vocals covered any need for stage decor. The top ticket price for a chorus line in 1975 was considered eye-popping at $15. Today, adjusted for inflation, that profit would be about $500,000. No show on Broadway had made that much profit in a week, and yet the show ran for 15 years. Broadway of the 1980s brought commercialism, corporate sponsorship, and spectacle to the party, but only if producers had guaranteed success with proven source material. People were tired of losing money. This meant we saw a lot of shows that were based on books or had previously been made into movies, like The Wizard of Oz, 42nd Street, Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, Singin' in the Rain, Meet Me in St. Louis, Carrie, and Fame. All of these were recognizable and popular works that might have a better time drawing a crowd, but we also heard some incredible new music from Sondheim with Merrily We Roll Along, Into the Woods, and European imports through composed music and epic storylines had us at times making a backwards glance towards the days of the Grand Opera, but not a long enough glance to keep us from moving ever forward. Even more than the recognizability of the source material and nostalgia for fluid and lush vocal lines, musical theater of the 80s brought us spectacle with the mega musicals of Les Miserables by Claude Michel Schoenberg, and Cats, and Phantom of the Opera by Andrew Lloyd Webber. Cats, a fantasy, non-storyline series of songs based on the poetry of T.S. Eliot, premiered in 1981. The show and its producers showed us how to really utilize marketing to bring in the crowds, and it's a good thing too. In the West End, it cost roughly £900,000 to produce, which roughly translates to $1,097,000 at today's conversion rate. On Broadway, it cost $5 million to produce. With a price tag like that, we had better see some spectacle. After Cats, Webber went on in '85 to premiere The Phantom of the Opera, the first fully automated show with state-of-the-art computerized light and soundboard and 130 company members. To better identify what we might mean by spectacle, here are some fun facts about the show today. Each performance has 230 costumes, 14 dressers, 200 different wigs, 120 automated cues, 22 scene changes, pyrotechnics, and the use of 250 kilograms of dry ice and 10 fog and smoke machines. A 1,200-pound, 10-foot-high chandelier with 6,000 beads falls 2.5 meters per second into the audience. The set includes a 1.5-ton retractable staircase and 25 hanging drops. The Phantom's makeup takes 2 hours to put on, with preparation process before he is fitted with the prosthetics, 2 wigs, 2 radio microphones, and 2 different contact lenses. By 2001, The Phantom of the Opera was the most financially successful entertainment event to date, with a total estimated worldwide gross receipts of over $5.6 billion. But that still wasn't enough at the time to really bring Broadway back. From the 1960s to the 90s, Times Square was considered to be the seediest part of town and became an infamous symbol of the city's decline. It was the center for sex shops, peep shows, adult theaters, and crime, and was known as the worst block in town. How do you compete with that? A part of town that people don't want to go to, and a requirement of spectacle in order to be successful enough to coax people in? Who else can compete at that level when it comes to spectacle and finances? The answer can be found in a little town just outside of Orlando, Florida called Kissimmee, home of Walt Disney World. In the mid-90s, New York's Mayor Rudy Giuliani led a huge effort to clean up Times Square. These changes were shaped in a large part by the actions of the Walt Disney Company, which bought and restored the New Amsterdam Theater after several attempts at redevelopment had failed. As part of a contract with Disney, security was increased, pornographic theaters were closed, low-rent residents were pressured to relocate, and then more tourist-friendly attractions and upscale establishments were opened. Walt Disney Theatrical Productions was formed in 1993 to produce Alan Menken's Beauty and the Beast, which opened in '94, and was then followed by Disney's The Lion King in 1997. But quickly, before we leave the 90s, we need to take a pause, because where there was a huge absence of truly original musicals being produced during this decade, one gem sticks out. It incorporated a hard rock genre of music and spoke to the issues faced through the AIDS crisis, poverty, drug abuse, homosexuality, and depression. Of course, I'm talking about Jonathan Larson's Rent, which broke our hearts twice. Once at the untimely death of the young composer the night before the premiere, and again at the beautiful and heartbreaking journey that is loosely based on Madame Butterfly. At the turn of the century, the show The Producers played a key role in the financial boom for more than just the score and the script. Rocco Landsman, the show's lead producer, was annoyed that scalpers were making huge profits from his show. His top ticket price was $100, but resellers were getting $1,000 on the street. Why would someone pay that, you ask? The casting was star-studded. In response to the scalpers, Landsman created premium pricing, putting his best seats at $480 each. The press screamed about price gouging, and rival producers thought he was nuts, but as long as Matthew Broderick and Nathan Lane were in the show, people paid the $480, and soon premium pricing became standard. So, now we find ourselves at the turn of the century with a shiny new Broadway that includes the spectacle of Weber and Disney, coupled with the new expectation of premium ticket prices, and musical theater again asks, how do we compete with that? The answer? Guaranteed hits. And where do we find guaranteed hits? That's right, on the radio and Billboard's Top 100. Enter the boom of the jukebox musical. In the vein of everything old is new again, jukebox musicals take us back to the ideas the composers of the Great American Songbook had. Use what's popular to listen to and make it work if you cast big stars and the tickets will sell. The waters were tested for the jukebox musical at the end of the 70s and expanded quite a bit through the 80s and the 90s, but exploded between 2000 and 2010 with 37 titles and arguably 61 titles from 2010 to present day. The most common form of jukebox musical is telling the life story of a specific artist, musician, or musical group. For example, Cher, Johnny Cash, Carole King, or Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. These shows tell the story while featuring the artist's music. Other types of jukebox musicals create a fictional plot and use the music of specific artists to tell that story, like we see with Mamma Mia, We Will Rock You, or Rock of Ages. The last type of jukebox musicals are adaptations of films, where the movie's soundtrack is used, like what we see in The Wedding Singer or Cruel Intentions the musical. But recycled albums brought to the stage isn't all that we get from the new century. You might call this new era a Renaissance era for musical theater because everything is being reborn and recreated. We can revisit a hint of opera with Adam Guttell's 2005 The Light in the Piazza, and his song cycles give us a return to a more classical style. Meanwhile, David Yazbek takes some classic movies and brings them to the stage by giving us The Full Monty in 2000, based on the 1997 film, and Dirty Rotten Scoundrels in 2005 from the 1988 movie. Janine Tessery gives us 2 screen-to-stage hits with Thoroughly Modern Millie in 2002 and Shrek the Musical in 2008. But she also wrote Fun Home, a new musical that was a story of sexual discovery told in non-linear vignettes connected by narration. Jason Robert Brown, known for his gorgeous power ballads, brought us Parade in 1998, with a story highlighting the trial of Jewish factory manager Leo Frank, who was accused and convicted of raping and murdering a 13-year-old employee. He also wrote The Last 5 Years in 2001, a contemporary musical that follows a couple through their courtship and divorce, with one side of the story starting at the beginning and one side starting at the end and working its way back. In 2014, he premiered The Bridges of Madison County, based on the 1992 novel and 95 film of the same title. And while we're talking about hit movies brought to the stage, we can't forget to mention Mel Brooks. As if the movies weren't enough, he brought to the theater cult classics like Young Frankenstein and, of course, The Producers. We saw some great original work from Max Shaman with Hairspray and Stephen Schwartz with Wicked, sung by today's teens like Les Mis was sung when I was young. But the biggest craze came with the inclusion of hip-hop, rap, and R&B in Lin-Manuel Miranda's In the Heights and Hamilton.
Shot. And yo, I'm just like my country. I'm young, scrappy, and hungry, and I'm not throwing away my shot. I'ma get a scholarship to King's College. I probably shouldn't brag, but dag, I'm amazed and astonished. The problem is a lot of brains, but no polish.
Some of these shows were cranked out quickly, and some were years and years in the making. If only there was a formula to know for sure what was going to make it big on Broadway. But until then, you can always hope that showy stunts and expensive props, like Richard and Robert Sherman's flying car in the 2002 show Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, created from the 1968 musical film, will keep you in business. The flying car currently holds the record for the most expensive prop from a theater show, with an estimated cost of $1.07 million to make. So, if truly original musicals are few and far between on Broadway, where can we go to find unique ideas and inspiring new songs? Let's try off-Broadway, or even off-Broadway, where the budgets don't kill while these artists fight for their chance to compete for a Tony. Join us for our next installment of Time Warp with The Journey from Off-Broadway to the Great White Way.